The horse screamed before anyone could stop it, a sound like torn metal, like something wild refusing to die quietly, and every man in that dusty yard took one step back. Every man except the one holding the lead rope, who let go anyway, because he had no other choice. The black stallion stood alone in the center of the auction pen, chest heaving, eyes white at the edges, a deep gash running from his left shoulder down toward his foreleg. Dried blood, old rope burns around his neck. He wasn't dangerous the way they said. He was broken and raging against it. Nobody bid. The auctioneer didn't even finish his sentence. And at the edge of the fence, her hands wrapped around the top rail, stood an old woman no one had spoken to in months. She was watching the horse the way you watch something you already understand. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If everyone around you decided you were finished, would you believe them? This story is about a 65-year-old widow who spent her last dollars on a horse everyone called a lost cause. The same horse they tried to take from her. The same horse that, in the end, did something no one in that town will ever forget. If you've ever been told you were too old, too slow, or too broken to matter, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Hit like if you believe some people are worth more than the price they're given. And subscribe, because the stories we tell here don't flinch. Now, let's go back to that fence. The town of Harrow Flats had a way of aging things faster than they deserved. The wind came down from the north every October, and it never really left. It just changed direction. It carved lines into wood, into paint, into the faces of the people who stayed. Most people didn't stay. They moved on to places with paved roads and grocery stores that didn't close on Sundays. But some people were made of the same material as the land, stubborn, layered, and impossible to simply relocate. Elena Voss was that kind of person. She had lived on the Shadow Ranch for 41 years. She had raised 2 children there, buried a husband there, and watched the property shift from something proud and productive to something that creaked in the wind like an apology. The east fence had been down since the spring before last. The barn roof had a gap the size of a card table that she covered with a tarp every winter and hoped for the best. The house itself still stood. She made sure of that. But it had the look of a place that was waiting for permission to give up. Elena didn't give it permission. Every morning, she rose before the sun, not out of habit anymore, but because sleep had become a visitor that arrived late and left early. She made coffee on a stove that had one working burner. She sat at the kitchen table where she and her husband Dale had eaten thousands of meals together, and she read whatever book she was working through, and she watched the dark outside the window slowly become gray. She was 65 years old. She had not been into Harrow Flats proper in 3 weeks. The last time she'd gone, it had been for flour and coffee and a small bag of oats, the bare minimum. She'd parked her truck in front of Greer's General, and while she was coming out, she had passed Warren Holt on the sidewalk. Warren Holt, who owned the land brokerage on Main Street, who had called her twice already that month with offers she hadn't asked for. He had looked at her the way people look at houses they're already calculating the demolition cost of. "Elena," he'd said, nodding. She'd nodded back without slowing down. That was the whole conversation. That was Harrow Flats. There was a time, she knew it, even if she didn't talk about it, when the Shadow Ranch had been something people respected. Dale had kept 40 head of cattle and a small string of horses. They'd had ranch hands for a decade, 2 at least. The children had ridden before they could read. There were summers when the property hummed with work and the smell of good grass and the sound of Dale whistling through his teeth while he fixed something. He was always fixing something. When he died, a quiet death, the way men like Dale died, in a hospital bed that looked nothing like him. Elena had tried to keep it all running. For 3 years she had tried. She'd hired one man, then couldn't pay him, then hired another. She'd sold the cattle in pieces, and then all at once. The horses had gone one by one. The land remained, but land without animals and without labor is just weight. Now she had the house, 37 acres of dry grass and old fence lines, and a reputation in town as the woman who hadn't figured out yet that it was over. She had figured it out. She just didn't agree with it. The morning of the auction, she had woken up with something uncomfortable in her chest. Not pain, not grief, but something older than both. A kind of recognition. She'd driven to the county fairgrounds the way you drive somewhere when you're not entirely sure why you're going. Only that not going feels wrong. She hadn't planned to spend any money. She had $412 left in her checking account. She knew that number exactly. She kept it in her head the way you keep track of something precious or something frightening. She wasn't always sure which. The fairgrounds smelled like dust and diesel and old leather. A few dozen people milled around the outer pens, looking at what was being sold. Mostly tack, some old equipment, 2 mules that looked embarrassed about it. Elena walked the rows with her hands in her pockets, not touching anything, not bidding on anything. And then she heard the sound. A crash, a chain rattling against metal. And then that scream, that terrible, furious scream of an animal that had not yet stopped fighting. She walked toward it the way you walk toward something you're afraid of but can't look away from. The black stallion was in the far pen, separated from everything else. He was big, 16 hands at least, maybe more, with a coat so dark it seemed to pull light in rather than reflect it. He was covered in dried mud along his flanks, and the gash on his shoulder had been bandaged badly, and the bandage had come half loose. He moved in tight, agitated circles, swinging his head, watching everything. The men around the pen kept their distance. Someone laughed nervously. "Kill Pen," said a man beside her. She glanced at him. A livestock dealer she'd seen before, but didn't know. Going to slaughter unless somebody's fool enough to bid. Been through 2 handlers this month. Bit one, put the other through a fence. Elena looked at the horse. The horse, strangely, looked back at her. Not a glance, a direct, sustained focus, the way animals look at things when they're trying to understand them. "What happened to him?" she asked. The dealer shrugged. Previous owner worked him hard and punished harder. That's what they say. He walked away. Elena stayed at the fence for a long time. When the auctioneer got to the stallion, the number on the block was low. Insultingly low. The kind of price that meant no one wanted the problem. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer looked around the yard with the weary expression of a man who had seen this before and didn't like where it was going. Elena raised her hand. She bought the horse for $380. She did not know, standing there at that fence with the receipt in her hand and her heart beating harder than it had in years, whether she had done something brave or something foolish. She suspected it might be both. She suspected, in a way she couldn't quite name, that the distinction didn't matter. She had 4 horses worth of memory on that ranch. She had 37 acres and a barn with a bad roof. She had $32 left to her name. And she had a horse that no one else wanted. She called him Bravura. Getting Bravura home was its own kind of negotiation. The livestock dealer agreed, reluctantly, for a fee Elena paid in cash she didn't have to spare, to trailer him to the ranch. The man who drove didn't say much, and when they arrived at the Shadow Ranch and he saw the state of the barn, he said even less. He backed the trailer up to the barn side entrance, lowered the ramp, and stepped well away. Bravura didn't move for 10 minutes. Elena stood at the bottom of the ramp. She didn't make a sound. She didn't cluck or wave or try to encourage him. She simply stood there, present, not reaching, not demanding. Eventually, the horse stepped down. He walked past her with the focused suspicion of an animal that had learned that humans with good intentions were usually followed by humans with bad ones. He went into the barn and stood in the largest stall, and Elena latched the door gently, and that was the first day. The second day, she brought him a bucket of water and a flake of hay and set them just inside the stall without going all the way in. He didn't come near while she was there. When she checked an hour later, both were half finished. The third day, she sat on a hay bale outside the stall and read aloud. She'd been doing this with herself for years, reading aloud in the empty house, filling the rooms with language because silence had a texture she didn't always want to feel. She was working through a collection of John Steinbeck novels she'd had since her 40s. She opened East of Eden and she read. Bravura stood at the back of the stall and listened. She didn't know if he understood. She didn't require that he understand. She just read, and the barn was quiet around her except for her voice and the occasional sound of wind in the tarp above, and the horse gradually, almost imperceptibly, stopped circling and stood still. By the end of the week, she was reading inside the stall. She sat in the corner on an overturned bucket close to the ground, making herself small and consistent and predictable. Bravura kept distance. He ate and drank. He watched her with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be recording everything, filing it somewhere, cross-referencing it with everything he knew about people. On the 8th day, he took a step toward her. One step. Then he stopped, pulled his head back slightly, like he regretted it. Elena didn't react. She kept reading. Her voice didn't change. The 9th day, he took 2 steps. The 10th day, he put his nose on her shoulder, very briefly, and then walked away. Elena sat very still for a long time after he did that. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. Not because she didn't feel things, but because she'd used up a particular reserve of tears in the year after Dale died. And now what she felt went somewhere else, somewhere deeper and quieter. She sat still and felt the weight of that small contact, and thought about what it meant to be trusted by something that had every reason not to trust. She began eating her meals in the barn. This was practical, she told herself. She was out there twice a day anyway, and the barn was only marginally colder than the house. But it was also something else. She brought 2 plates sometimes, one for herself, one set nearby for no reason at all, since horses don't eat human food, but somehow the gesture felt right. The sharing of space. The acknowledgement that they were both in this together, both making do with what was left. Bravura watched her eat. He stopped pacing entirely by the 2nd week. He let her touch his neck on a Tuesday afternoon, in the particular way that animals allow touch, not enduring it, but leaning into it, just slightly, the muscle under her palm relaxing like a breath let go. She worked around the wound on his shoulder carefully. She had some veterinary supplies she'd kept from the ranch's working days, and she cleaned and redressed the gash every other morning. The wound began to close. He was not tame. She never used that word, not even in her own mind. He was not a pet, and he was not a riding horse, and he was not a symbol of anything as far as she was concerned. He was a living thing that had been harmed and was healing. She was a living thing that had been emptied and was learning to be full again in different ways. They were each other's company. She didn't tell anyone in town about the horse. There was no one in town she told things to. The neighbors, the Prager family to the north, the Duttons to the south, had not come by since Dale's funeral, and even then it had been brief and perfunctory. She was aware that she existed in their minds as a problem they hadn't solved yet, a piece of land attached to a stubborn woman who refused to behave like a logical transaction. She was aware of Warren Holt and what he wanted. She'd been aware of it for 2 years. He'd offered her a number the first time that was insultingly low, and the second time the number had gone up, but the tone had gone down, and the third call had had something underneath it that wasn't quite a threat, but was practicing to be one. She hadn't called back. She fed bravura from her hand for the first time on the 15th day. He took the handful of oats carefully, his lips delicate and precise the way horses' lips are, and he looked at her from this close distance, 2 feet, no more, with an expression that she interpreted as something between assessment and acknowledgement. She spoke to him quietly. Not commands, not instructions, just conversation. She told him about Dale, about the ranch when it was full, about her daughter in Phoenix who called on birthdays and major holidays, and her son in Denver who didn't call at all. She talked about the particular loneliness of being someone's mother and no longer being needed in that way. She talked about the loneliness of sleeping in a house where every room remembered something you'd lost. Bravura stood in the late afternoon light and listened. He did not offer solutions. He did not offer pity. He simply stood there, present and warm and breathing, and that was, Elena thought, exactly enough. Warren Holt drove up the ranch road on a Wednesday morning. He came in his white truck, the clean, expensive kind that had never once been used to move anything, and he parked in front of the house and sat there for a moment before getting out, the way men do when they're composing something. Elena saw him from the barn. She didn't go to meet him. He knocked on the house door first, waited, knocked again. Then he turned and saw her standing in the barn entrance, and he walked across the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets and a look on his face that was trying to be pleasant. Elena, he said. Warren, she said. He glanced past her into the barn. She didn't move to let him see more. Heard you were at the auction last week, he said. I was. Heard you bought that horse. His voice was careful, studiedly neutral. The black one. I did. Warren exhaled. Not a sigh exactly. More like a man releasing something he'd been holding. Elena, I have to be honest with you. People are talking. People talk about everything. This is different. That animal put 2 men in the hospital. That's the story going around. He paused. Sheriff Grady's been hearing it too. Something shifted in Elena's stomach. Not fear. She recognized the thing beneath fear, which was the knowledge that someone had decided to use something against you and had already begun constructing the mechanism. Bravura hasn't put anyone in anything, she said. He's healing. Bravura. Warren repeated the name with a slight smile she didn't like. Elena, look, I'm not here as your enemy. I'm here because I'm worried. He paused again, and the pause was too long and too practiced. You've got a dangerous animal on a property that already has concerns. Safety concerns. The fence on the east side. I know about my fence. The county has codes, Elena, for keeping livestock, for secure enclosure. He looked at her with something that was almost kindness and was nothing like it. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying that if someone files a complaint, the sheriff's going to have to respond. And then it won't be my decision or your decision anymore. She looked at him steadily. Are you the someone who's going to file the complaint? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. I just think, he said, that this could all be resolved very simply. She turned back to the barn. Good morning, Warren. Elena. I said good morning. He stood there for a moment longer, then walked back to his white truck and drove down the road without looking back. Elena went inside the barn and sat down on the hay bale and looked at Bravura. The horse looked back at her. His ears were forward, alert, tracking the sounds of Warren's truck until it faded completely. He's going to be a problem, she said. Bravura shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose, a low, soft sound, almost like an agreement. She had 3 days before the call came. It came from Sheriff Grady's office, delivered by a deputy she didn't know, a young man who was clearly embarrassed about the errand and kept his eyes slightly off her face while he read from a clipboard. A formal complaint had been filed regarding an animal of unstable temperament and unknown vaccination history being maintained on a property with inadequate containment infrastructure. She had 72 hours to demonstrate that the animal was under control and the property was up to code, or the animal would be seized. She stood at the door and held the paper and watched the deputy's truck disappear down her road, and she felt the particular cold of a situation that has been engineered against you by someone with more resources and more patience than you've been giving them credit for. 72 hours. The east fence was down. She had no money to fix it. She had a horse that no one had seen behave calmly, because no one but her had been patient enough to stand still long enough. She went back into the barn. Bravura came to the stall door without prompting. He rested his chin gently on the top rail and looked at her, and she put her hand against his jaw, and she thought. You have 3 days, she told herself. Figure it out. The first thing she did was drive into town, not to Warren's office and not to the sheriff's. She drove to the hardware store and she stood in the fencing aisle with $32 in her pocket and looked at what $32 would and wouldn't do. It wouldn't do much. She bought wire staples and a roll of barbed wire that was half a roll, technically speaking, a return someone had brought back, and she drove home and started on the east fence at noon. She worked until the light went. Her hands were cut by the wire by the time she finished the first section. She wrapped them in a dish towel and kept going. The post driver was too heavy for her to swing efficiently, and her shoulder ached by the 4th post. But she set 6 posts before dark and strung wire between them, and it wasn't right, and it wasn't up to code, but it was something. She ate standing in the kitchen, too tired to sit. The second day, she rose before 4 and started again. Her neighbor to the south, Roy Dutton, drove past on the county road around mid-morning and slowed down. She saw his truck slow, and she kept working. She didn't look up. She waited for him to stop and offer help or stop and say something cruel, but he didn't either. He sped up and kept going. That night she did her math again, and it didn't improve. The fence might pass a casual inspection, but wouldn't survive a deliberate one. The barn roof was another issue. The tarp had come loose in Tuesday's wind, and there was now a gap that let in light. And there was the vaccination question. Bravura had no documented history at all. She called the county extension office and left a message about emergency vet access. They didn't call back. She called the one veterinarian she knew, a woman named Dr. Aldred who had retired 2 years ago, but still sometimes helped out in real emergencies. Dr. Aldred picked up on the 3rd ring. Eleanor Voss, the older woman, said, "Haven't heard from you in a while." "I have a situation," Elena said. She explained. Dr. Aldred was quiet through most of it, asking only a few technical questions. At the end, she said, "I'll come by tomorrow morning. Can't promise what I can and can't document, but I'll see what I can do. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I hear this horse has a reputation. His reputation is wrong." A pause. "All right," Dr. Aldred said. Elena hung up and sat with the phone in her hand in the half-dark kitchen, And for a moment, the weight of all of it was very physical. In her hands, in her shoulders, in the back of her neck. She was 65 years old, and she was alone, and she was fighting a man with a truck that cost more than her barn to keep a horse that weighed half a ton and couldn't tell anyone what it needed. She thought about Dale, about what he would have said. He wouldn't have said anything clever. Dale wasn't a man for clever things. He would have gotten up at 4 in the morning and picked up the post driver and started working. That's what she knew about him. She got up at 4 the next morning and started working. Dr. Aldred arrived at 7 with her bag and a cautious expression. She stood at the barn entrance and looked at Bravura, who was watching her from the back of the stall, and she said, quietly, "All right, I see what you mean about him." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. "He's not wild," the vet said. "He's watching. There's a difference." She set her bag down. "How do you want to do this?" "Let me go in first," Elena said. She went into the stall. She spoke quietly to Bravura, her hand on his neck, and he leaned into her palm the way he had started to do. That small, muscular yielding that was becoming the most reliable thing in her life. Dr. Aldred came in slowly, and Bravura watched her, and his ears moved back and then forward again. He let the vet examine him, not without protest. He shifted, he huffed, he stamped once when the shoulder was touched too firmly. But he didn't strike. He didn't rear. He breathed hard and rolled his eye and stayed where he was. Dr. Aldred did what she could with the documentation. She was careful about what she was certifying and what she was observing, but she was not unkind about it. When she left, she told Elena to call her if the situation escalated, and she said it in the tone of a woman who expected it to escalate. Harrow Flats was not a big town. By that afternoon, the word had moved. Elena was at the hardware store picking up a second roll of wire. She had moved money from savings she didn't have. Technically, had called her daughter in Phoenix, who had wired $50 without asking too many questions, when she heard it. 2 women in the next aisle over, voices pitched for privacy, but not pitched low enough. Knew this would happen. Woman's been on her own too long. She's lost her mind over some horse. Warren says the property's a liability, has been for years. Hard to watch, is all. Elena picked up her wire and walked to the register without letting her face do anything she'd regret. But outside, in the truck, she sat for a moment. Hard to watch. That phrase. She turned the key and drove home. That night, something changed in the barn. She went out at 10 to check on Bravura, her last check before bed, a habit now, and she found him standing at the stall door, watching the back of the barn. She stopped, followed his gaze, saw nothing. "What is it?" she asked. He turned to look at her briefly, then back to the darkness at the end of the barn. She got the lantern and walked the length of the building. Found nothing. But the feeling he was tracking was real. She could see it in the set of his ears, in the particular alertness of his body. Something had been there, or was there, or had passed close enough to leave a trace. She didn't sleep well that night. The deadline was now 24 hours away. In the morning, she found the evidence. Tire tracks in the soft mud behind the barn. Not her truck's tracks, not a pattern she recognized. Someone had come down the access path behind the property in the night and stopped and turned around. The tracks were fresh. She stood over them for a long time. Then she went to the house and called Sheriff Grady's office directly. The deputy who answered was not the same young man who'd delivered the notice. This one sounded older, more practiced at being unhelpful. He took her information without urgency. He told her that tire tracks on her own property were not, in themselves, evidence of anything. He told her he'd note it. His voice had the texture of a filing cabinet closing. She hung up. She thought about Warren Holt and what he was willing to do. There was something she'd been aware of for a long time, in the background, unexamined, a piece of history she'd absorbed from Dale years ago without fully processing it. Warren Holt's father had tried to buy this land from Elena's father-in-law in the 1970s. Had tried hard. Had failed. The land had come to Dale through inheritance and to Elena through marriage, and somewhere in Warren Holt's relationship to this property was something older than business. A story about defeat that had been passed down. People like that, Dale used to say, don't forget. They wait. She went back to the barn. Bravura came to the door immediately. She looked at him in the morning light. The wound on his shoulder was healing cleanly now, the flesh knitting, the hair beginning to come back at the edges. He was standing better. He'd gained weight. His coat had a sheen to it that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. He looked, she thought, like something that had decided to continue. "They're coming tomorrow," she told him. He didn't react to the words. He reacted to her tone, a small movement of his ears, a tilt of attention. "I need you to be what I know you are," she said. "Not what they decided you were before they met you." He pushed his forehead gently against her shoulder. She stood there with this horse pressing his enormous head against her, and she understood something she hadn't quite put into words before. She had not saved him. She had not tamed him. She had simply been present, consistently and without agenda, and he had made his own decision about what she was. The trust was his. She had just not done anything to destroy it. That was, she realized, not a small thing. Dr. Aldred called that afternoon with one piece of news. "I have a colleague who can be there tomorrow morning," she said. "Young man, works with a rescue organization. He's seen difficult horses. He's willing to come and observe, maybe speak to your situation professionally." "Why would he do that?" Elena asked. A pause. "Because I told him about the horse, and he said some things that made me think he knows what's actually going on here." Another pause. "His name is Marcus. He'll be there at 8. "All right. Elena." Dr. Aldred's voice shifted slightly, softer, more careful. "What Warren is doing, the people around here, the things they've been saying. You know you're not wrong about this horse." "I know," she said, "just making sure." After she hung up, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the barn and the property stretching behind it, and she thought about what the land meant. Not the money it represented to Warren, not the legal category it fell into, but what it actually was. This particular arrangement of soil and grass and fence line and memory. This place where her children had learned to walk, where Dale had died in a hospital 30 miles away and been brought back to rest in the ground under the old oak near the east fence. What it meant to leave would be, she understood, something she could not survive in the way she was currently surviving. She was not being sentimental. She was being accurate. They came at 9 o'clock, not at 8, when Marcus arrived in a modest truck with a horse rescue logo on the door. Not at the hour when Elena had already been up for 5 hours working on the last section of east fence with Marcus helping, the two of them driving posts in the early cold, not talking much, just working. Marcus was 30-something, quiet, with the unhurried movements of someone who spent most of his time around animals and had calibrated his pace accordingly. He had gone into the barn alone, first. Without asking, Elena had watched from outside and said nothing. He'd come out after 10 minutes and said, "He's not dangerous." "I know," she said. "He's been traumatized. He's been in pain. There's a difference." He picked up the post driver. "Where do you need this next?" So by 9 o'clock, when Sheriff Grady's truck came down her road, the fence was done. All of it, the whole east section, not perfect but solid and strung tight. And Marcus was standing in the yard with his hands in his pockets, and Bravura was in the barn. Warren Holt's white truck came right behind the sheriff's. Elena had expected that. She hadn't expected the two other trucks behind Warren's, the Priegers from the north, and someone she didn't immediately recognize but placed after a moment as Gary Dutton, Roy's son, who had a seat on the county zoning board. Of course, she thought. Sheriff Grady was a big man, deliberate in his movements, with a face that had spent 40 years trying not to give anything away. He was not, Elena believed, fundamentally a cruel man. He was a man who went where the pressure went, and right now the pressure was all on one side. "Elena," he said, "appreciate you making time." "It's my property," she said. "It's always my time." Grady's mouth did something small and controlled. He glanced at Marcus. "This is Marcus Hale," Elena said. "He works with a horse rescue organization. He's observed the animal, and he's willing to speak to his assessment." Warren, behind Grady, made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, but something in the neighborhood of both. "The complaint isn't about outside opinions," Warren said. "It's about code compliance and public safety." "Then look at the fence," Elena said. Grady did. He walked the east perimeter slowly, and Elena walked with him, and Marcus walked on the other side, and Warren and his group hovered at a distance. The fence held under Grady's inspection. Each post, each line of wire, each connection. He didn't say anything while he looked, but his face did something slightly different by the end of it. "Barn roof," Warren called from across the yard. Elena turned to face him. "Repaired," she said. "I'd like to see that." "Then come and see it." They walked to the barn. Inside, the tarp was gone and the gap in the roof was sealed. She had spent the previous afternoon on a ladder with wood and roofing nails, and she had sealed it herself. and it wasn't going to win any aesthetic prizes, but it was solid. Bravura was at the stall door. He stood watching the group enter the barn. His ears went forward. His body was still. He looked, Elena thought, like exactly what he was, a large, serious, watchful animal that had assessed the situation and was waiting. That animal needs to be let out for inspection, Warren said. The complaint specifically. I'll bring him out, Elena said. You shouldn't, Grady started. I'll bring him out, she said again. She went to the stall door. She spoke to Bravura quietly. She attached the lead rope. He let her. He lowered his head slightly, the way he did now when she approached, and she opened the stall door and walked him out. Into the center of the barn. Into the light. He walked beside her with the particular composure of an animal that had made a decision. His gait was even. His head was level. He breathed steadily. The group of men and the two Priegers and Gary Dutton stood along the barn wall and watched. Nobody spoke. Bravura stood in the shaft of morning light coming through the repaired roof section, and there was no other word for it, magnificent. The heeled shoulder, the black coat with its returned sheen, the intelligent dark eyes moving calmly across the assembly of people who had come here expecting chaos. This is the animal you described as a public safety risk, Marcus said to Grady, his voice level and professionally neutral. He was addressing the sheriff and not Warren, a choice Elena noted. Grady looked at the horse. He looked at Elena's hand on the lead rope, steady and relaxed. He looked at the horse again. He's been treated, Marcus continued. He's been on this property for 3 weeks. He is not exhibiting any of the behaviors described in the complaint. I'd be willing to put that in writing. This is not a veterinary review, Warren started. Warren. Grady's voice was quiet. A single word. Warren stopped. The sheriff stood for another moment. Then he turned to Elena. I'm going to need a written statement from your vet and from Mr. Hale here. If that documentation is complete and consistent with what I'm seeing, I don't have grounds to seize the animal. Warren made a sharp sound. Warren, Grady said again, in the same tone. Elena kept her eyes on the sheriff. You'll have it by end of day. Grady nodded. He turned and walked out of the barn without looking at Warren. After a moment, the others followed. Elena listened to the engines starting, to the trucks turning around in the yard, to the sound of them receding. When the last engine faded, she turned to Bravura. He was watching her face. She put her forehead against his neck and stood there for a long moment, not saying anything. That evening, a man came with a contract. He was not Warren Holt. He was a man named Silvestri, well-dressed for Harrow Flats, which meant his boots were clean, who said he represented a traveling exhibition that would be in the region through the fall. He had a card. He used words like acquisition and fair market value and mutual benefit with the ease of a man who used them frequently. He wanted Bravura. The offer was $8,000. Elena stood at the kitchen door holding the card and listening and felt the number move through her like something cold moving through warm water. $8,000 would fix the roof properly, would rebuild the east fence entirely, would pay 6 months of property taxes, would put food in the house and gas in the truck and something in the account that functioned as a margin between her and the next crisis. He's a beautiful animal, Silvestri said, with the tone of a man who found all animals beautiful in the way he found all transactions beautiful. He'd be well cared for, seen by thousands of people. Seen, Elena repeated. Appreciated. She looked at the card. Then she looked at the man. In what context would he be seen? She asked. Silvestri's expression shifted slightly, not quite discomfort, but the near neighbor of it. We run a family-focused show. Demonstrations, performances. He's a horse that was mistreated, she said. He spent years under someone who used pain as instruction. You're describing a performance environment. Crowds, noise, restraint. Silvestri opened his mouth. Thank you for coming, she said, and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the card for a long time. Then she put it on the table, and she went to the barn, and she sat with Bravura until the last light was gone. She didn't sleep. She lay in bed and ran the numbers again, and they did not improve. She owed 7 months of property taxes. The truck needed work she'd been deferring. The barn roof she'd fixed herself would last a season, maybe 2. There were things coming apart faster than she could hold them together. And she was 65 years old, and she was alone, and $8,000 was not a small number. But she thought about the look of Bravura's eye in the barn light. She thought about the day he put his nose on her shoulder. She thought about the sound he made, that low, quiet sound, almost under hearing, when she read to him. She thought about the thing he had given her that she hadn't known she was missing, the experience of being trusted by something that could calculate the cost of trust. She thought about what she was actually deciding. Not horse versus money. That was Warren's framing and Silvestri's framing and the framing of everyone who saw her situation as a transaction needing resolution. She was deciding who she was. She had spent 41 years on this land. She had raised a family on it, buried a husband on it, survived seasons of loss on it. And for the last several years, she had been allowing the town, Warren's voice, the Prieger's silence, the deputy's clipboard, to slowly convince her that survival was all that remained. That the question was merely how long and on what terms. But she had bought a horse that no one else would buy. She had sat in a barn and read John Steinbeck aloud until a traumatized animal stopped circling and stood still. She had fixed a fence in the dark with cut hands. She was not a woman in decline. She was a woman who had not been given anything interesting to fight for until 3 weeks ago. She got up at 2 in the morning. She went to the kitchen table and picked up Silvestri's card and tore it in half. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to her daughter in Phoenix. Not a request, not an apology, but an account. She wrote it by hand, the way her generation had written things that mattered, and she wrote the truth of where she was and what she was doing and why. She sealed it and left it on the table to mail in the morning. And then she went back to the barn. Bravura was awake. The night horses always seemed to be. She sat on the hay bale and opened the Steinbeck, and she read by lamplight while the horse stood close and the property around them was dark and still, and she felt. Not peace exactly, not certainty, but something that was the shape of the right decision, the weight of it, the particular steadiness that comes not from winning, but from finally stopping pretending you're okay with losing. The inspection was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning. Marcus Hale arrived early again, and this time he brought Dr. Aldred, who had decided apparently that she wasn't retired enough to sit this one out. The documentation was complete. Elena had it organized in a folder on the kitchen table. The vet records Marcus had helped compile, Dr. Aldred's written assessment, a brief professional statement from Marcus himself on official letterhead. At 9:40, she went to the barn and brought Bravura out. She walked him in the yard while she waited. Just the two of them, moving in easy circles in the morning light, his breath visible in the cold air, his hooves quiet on the hard ground. She didn't have a plan. She had herself and the horse and the documentation and the fixed fence and the repaired roof, and she had the simple truth of what was in front of her. At 10:02, the procession of trucks came down her road again. Same cast. Grady first, Warren behind him, the Priegers and Gary Dutton trailing. A new addition. A county official Elena didn't know, with a state vehicle and the posture of a man who had been briefed by one side and was about to encounter the other side unexpectedly. Elena stood in the center of the yard with Bravura beside her, not holding the lead rope tightly. Loosely, one hand, the way you hold something when you trust it. The horse stood beside her without restraint, without tension, his head at her shoulder level, his eyes moving through the arriving vehicles with calm assessment. Warren got out first. He saw Elena. He saw the horse. He saw Marcus and Dr. Aldred standing by the barn. His face went through several things quickly: surprise, calculation, and then a kind of recalibration that men like Warren do when they realize the situation isn't what they arranged. He walked to Grady's side and spoke quietly. Elena didn't move. Grady and the county official walked over. They looked at the horse. They looked at Elena. Documentation? Grady asked. In the house, she said. I'll get it in a moment. She didn't move toward the house yet, because there was something happening with the horse that she wanted them to see, and she wanted them to see it in their own time, in the open air, without it being pointed out. Bravura stood beside her. And then, slowly, not dramatically, not as a performance, but with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a large animal that has assessed a situation and made its decision, he lowered himself to his knees. Not a stumble, not a loss of balance. He folded his front legs and went down deliberately, his great body settling, his head coming level with Elena's, and then lower, until he was kneeling in the yard, beside the woman who had bought him with her last $32 and sat with him through 2 weeks of darkness and read him Steinbeck. And he rested there in the posture of something that was, in the only language available to it, choosing to be seen. Complete silence in the yard. Warren said nothing. The county official said nothing. Gary Dutton, near the back, said nothing. Even the Priegers, who had driven past Elena fixing her fence alone and hadn't stopped, said nothing. Dr. Aldred, standing by the barn, made a sound, very small, and turned her face slightly away. Elena put her hand on Bravura's neck. She didn't say anything either. There was nothing to say. What was happening was not a trick. It was not trained behavior. It was an animal that had learned, slowly and through consistent experience, that this person was safe, and that this moment was safe, and that it did not need to be anything other than what it was. The horse had not been broken. He had been broken of something. The assumption that all humans were the same. Grady cleared his throat. The documentation, he said again, and his voice was different. I'll get it, Elena said. She went to the house. She came back with the folder. She handed it to Grady. He read it slowly. He handed it to the county official. The official read it. He asked Marcus 2 questions that Marcus answered without embellishment. Then the official turned to Warren. The complaint, he said, does not appear to be substantiated. Warren drew breath. The property is in compliance, the official continued. The animal shows no behavioral indicators consistent with the description in the original complaint. A pause. Mr. Holt, who submitted this complaint? Warren's jaw was working slightly. It's a matter of public record, the official said. I'm asking as a courtesy. A long pause. Warren said nothing. Grady looked at Elena. He looked at the horse, which had risen from his knees and was now standing calmly beside her as though nothing of particular significance had happened. Grady's face, for just a moment, had an expression that wasn't quite shame but was in that neighborhood. Ms. Voss, he said, we're done here. They were not done. Elena understood this at 2 in the morning when she woke to the smell. She had woken to Dale's voice, or the memory of it, some dream she was already losing. And then the smell hit her, and she was fully upright before she was fully awake, because some things the body recognizes before the mind catches up. Smoke. She pulled on boots and coat, and went out the door and saw the orange along the bottom edge of the barn, and she ran. Later she would not remember much of the running. She remembered the heat on her face before she reached the barn door. She remembered Bravura's voice, that sound he made, usually low and quiet, now torn and panicked in a way that cut through everything. She remembered the door handle burning her palm and releasing it and grabbing it again through her coat sleeve and pulling it open. She went in. The fire was at the back of the barn, the far corner, where no one had reason to be at night, where the dry wood was oldest and most willing. She could see its shape now, could see it growing. She could see Bravura at the front of the barn, at the stall door, and his eyes were white and his whole body was shaking with the effort of staying when every instinct in him was screaming to run. She got to the stall, got the door open, got her hand on his neck. Come on, she said. She said it low, underneath the crackling, the way you talk to something when you need it to hear you past its fear. Come on. It's all right. Come on. He wouldn't move. She put her palm flat on his chest, her face at his jaw, and she kept talking, kept the voice steady, kept it the voice he knew, the Steinbeck voice, the hay bale voice, the voice of 2 weeks of mornings when nothing was required of him and nothing was taken. He moved. He followed her out of the stall, through the smoke that was thickening along the rafters, out through the barn door and into the cold yard. She got 10 feet from the barn and let go of the lead rope, and he ran. Hard. Around the perimeter of the yard, the terror finally unleashed, and she let him run and turned back to the barn. The fire was not going to be stopped. She knew that. She wasn't going back in for anything. She called 911 from the yard, and she stood and watched it, and she called Marcus, and she called Dr. Aldred, and then she stood in the cold with the smoke rising, and she watched 41 years' worth of barn burn. She didn't cry. Bravura completed his laps of the yard and came back to her. He was shaking. She was shaking. She put her arm over his neck and they stood together, and the barn burned, and the fire trucks arrived eventually. And they were too late for the structure, but not too late for the property lines. And by morning there was nothing left but the stone foundation and ash and the smell that would stay in the ground for a long time. The fire investigator came in the daylight. He walked the foundation. He took samples. He asked her questions in the careful tone of someone who already suspects the answer. Do you have any reason to believe someone would want to damage this property? He asked. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. I have a very specific reason. Harrow Flats had a way of knowing things. By noon that day, word had moved through the town in the particular way it moved when something had crossed a line that even people who didn't like Elena Voss could see. The arson investigation was open. The investigator had found tire tracks behind the property. The same pattern, the same position Elena had reported 2 days earlier to the deputy who had filed it nowhere useful. There were only so many white trucks in Harrow Flats. She didn't go to town that day. She didn't need to. Marcus came and helped her set up a temporary shelter for Bravura, a 3-sided lean-to at the edge of the east pasture, built from lumber the Duttons brought over in Roy Dutton's truck. Roy Dutton, who had driven past her fixing the fence alone and hadn't stopped, showed up at 8 in the morning with his truck bed full of timber and his son Gary, and not a word of explanation. Elena accepted the lumber. The Priegers brought feed, 2 bags of oats, a bale of hay, left at the end of the drive without a knock on the door, the gesture of people who couldn't quite apologize but could act. Dr. Aldred brought coffee and a check for $500. Don't, Elena started. I'm not doing this for you, the old vet said. I'm doing it because I'm angry and I need somewhere to put it. Elena took the check. Marcus made calls on her behalf to a nonprofit organization that helped rural landowners with emergency repairs. By the end of the day, he'd secured a commitment for a barn rebuild consultation. Not a barn. Not yet. Maybe not for months. But the beginning of one. The investigation moved faster than Harrow Flats investigations usually moved. Warren Holt was not arrested that week, but his name appeared in the investigator's report in a way that would generate further inquiries, and that report became, inevitably, a thing that people in Harrow Flats had opinions about. The county commissioner's office received a letter. Marcus had written it. Elena had signed it, detailing the timeline of the complaint, the inspection, and the fire. Silvestri, the exhibition man, was contacted and asked where he'd gotten Elena's name and address. The answers that came back from that thread did not help Warren Holt. None of this happened dramatically. This was not a movie. Warren did not confess in public and no one clapped. What happened was slower and less satisfying and ultimately more real. A man who had accumulated influence through patience and proximity began to lose it through the same mechanism. Questions were asked. Documents were requested. Decisions about his brokerage's county contracts were reconsidered. He left Harrow Flats by February. Elena heard about it from Dr. Aldred, who had heard from someone else, who had heard it as a third-hand story. She was in the barn, the lean-to, temporarily, while the foundation was poured for the new structure, reading to Bravura when she heard it. She turned the page. The horse stood in the morning light, healed and present, his nose warm against her shoulder. What she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter, the satisfaction of a long-held breath finally released. The particular peace that comes when the story you've been living inside finally catches up to the truth you've been holding. She read to the end of the chapter. The call came from her son. She hadn't heard from Thomas in 14 months. Not a birthday call, not a holiday text. She had stopped expecting it in the way you stop expecting certain weathers and certain seasons. He called on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the fire, while she was in the temporary shelter doing Bravura's morning grooming. She saw the number on the phone screen and stood still for a moment. She answered, "Mom." His voice was older than she remembered. Not older badly, just changed, the way voices change when years accumulate in them. "I heard about the fire." "How did you hear?" she asked. A pause. "Julia called me. Her daughter in Phoenix. She was worried. She said she didn't know how bad it was." "The barn's gone," Elena said. "I'm rebuilding." Silence on the line. She kept grooming Bravura, the brush moving in even strokes, the horse calm. "Mom," Thomas said again, and the word had a different weight the second time. I should have called before now. "I know that." "Yes," she said. "I want to come," he said. "If you'll let me." She stopped brushing. She thought about this. About what she would be letting in if she said yes. Not just Thomas, but the version of the conversation they'd never had. The accounting she'd been postponing, the particular complexity of loving someone who had left and not come back and was now offering to return. She thought about what she needed and what she didn't need, and what the land needed and what she might, finally, be willing to accept. "There's a lot of work to be done," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean actual work. The foundation's poured, but the frame needs to go up." "I'm not a young woman." A sound, not quite a laugh. "Almost." "I know, Mom." "All right," she said. "Come." After she hung up, she told Bravura about it. The horse turned his head slightly, listening. She finished the grooming in silence. She didn't know what Thomas's arrival would mean. What version of her son would get off the plane? What version of their relationship was still viable after the silence? She knew that reopening a door was not the same as restoring what had been behind it. She knew that some things required rebuilding the way a barn required rebuilding. From the foundation up, one piece at a time, with no guarantee the structure would look anything like the original. But the foundation was there. That was enough to start. Thomas came in March. He looked like Dale in ways that surprised her. The way he stood, the angle of his jaw, the instinct he had to look at things that needed fixing and walk toward them rather than away. He was 41 years old, and he was not the person who had left, and she was not the person he had left, and the ranch was not the ranch it had been, and none of that was a problem the way she had once feared it would be. They worked. They talked less than they needed to and more than they expected to. And some conversations were left unfinished and would be finished later, and some things that had calcified between them began, slowly, to soften. Bravura watched Thomas with extreme suspicion for the first 4 days. On the 5th day, he allowed Thomas to bring him water. On the 8th day, he accepted a handful of oats. Elena watched this from the fence and said nothing. Some negotiations were private. The barn frame went up on a cold Saturday in late March. Marcus came. Dr. Aldred came. Roy Dutton came with 2 neighbors Elena hadn't expected, and together they raised the frame in a single long day, and by evening the structure was standing against the sky in the particular way that new things stand, raw and unfinished and full of what they might become. Elena stood at the edge of the property as the light changed and looked at it. The land stretched behind her. The old oak where Dale was buried, the east fence she had fixed alone in the dark, the pasture where Bravura had run in terror and then come back to stand beside her. The foundation of what had burned and the frame of what was being built, and the sky the same color it had always been. She heard hooves behind her. She turned. Bravura had walked out of the lean-to on his own and stood 10 feet away, watching her the way he watched things he was deciding about. Then he came the rest of the way and stood beside her, enormous and warm, his breath rising in the cold air. They stood at the edge of the property together and looked at what was there. "There it is," she said quietly. The horse didn't move. The thing about horses, the thing she had learned from 41 years with them and relearned in the last several months, was that they didn't lie. They couldn't. Everything they were was in the body, in the breath, in the presence or absence of tension. When a horse stood beside you quietly and let its weight rest and its eyes soften, it was not a performance. It was a judgment. She had been judged worthy, not by the town, not by the county official or the sheriff or the men in clean trucks who had come to take things, but by a 400-kilogram animal that had every reason to trust no one and had decided, slowly and on its own terms, to trust her. That was worth more than what any of them had tried to take. The last light went. She walked back to the house, and Bravura walked beside her the way he had started doing. Not led, not directed, just alongside, his hooves quiet on the ground, his presence steady and warm. Thomas came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without speaking. They stood on the porch and looked at the barn frame standing in the dark, and the land beyond it, and the sky above all of it. "It's a good place," Thomas said. "It always was," she said. They drank their coffee. The wind came from the north and moved through the new timber of the frame and the old grass of the pasture and the branches of the oak tree where Dale had been buried, and everything it touched was something that had endured. That, Elena thought, was its own kind of answer. The truest wildness she had ever seen was not in the black horse that had raged in the kill pen. It was in the men who had watched and calculated and decided that a woman alone was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be met. Animals that have never been loved can be loved. Men who have forgotten how are a different project altogether. But some of them, she believed, came back too. In time. In their own ways. Sometimes carrying lumber. Sometimes carrying coffee. Sometimes just showing up at a door you hadn't expected and saying the name they'd been given you since the beginning. Mom. Bravura stood in the cold yard and was still. The barn frame stood against the stars. Elena Voss, 65 years old, on the land she had not surrendered, drank her coffee and did not look away from any of it. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. You sat with Elena. You sat with a horse that the world had written off. and you watch what happens when someone refuses the story that's being written for them. This is what we do here. We tell the stories that most people don't tell, about people who endure, about animals that trust, about the quiet courage of someone who fixes a fence in the dark with cut hands because the alternative is losing something that matters. If this moved you, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. If you know someone who's been told they're finished, send them this. Hit like, subscribe. The next story is already coming, and it starts the same way this one did, with someone that no one expected, doing something no one was paying attention to. That's where everything that matters always starts. See you there.